Dr. Pasi Vainikka, co-founder and CEO of Solar Foods, sat down for an interview with our director of content, Nick Weinberg. Stay tuned. I'm sure you'll love this conversation as much as I did.
So tonight's topic is exploring innovation to combat the climate crisis. And our current agricultural system accounts for nearly 25% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, and it's growing due to the exploding population. For those who may be unfamiliar with how food is currently produced at scale, can you explain why agriculture is no longer sustainable?
Yeah, as said, about 1/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions are due to what we eat, and the 75% is due how we use energy, basically due burning fossil fuels. There are technologies to change the energy system to be carbon neutral, but hardly any to change something fundamental in our food system to make it sustainable. The food system is, if we have one core problem in the energy system, which is burning fossil fuels and mining fossil fuels, food system is, you could say, a child with many problems. About 70% of the fresh water withdrawals on the planet are used for irrigation in agriculture. We use a lot of pesticides that causes harm to diversity of life, and basically some species might be extinct. We do cut forest, a lot of forest for agricultural land, so the carbon stock bound in trees in forests are lost. In addition, the main problem basically was what has to do with the emissions has to do with the concept of animal and basically beef that we eat, the inherent emissions from cows. In addition, we also use a lot of fertilizers on open land that causes eutrophication. And it doesn't even end there. The largest global annual wild marine catch was over 20 years ago. Since that, the wild catch has been declined. You don't see that at supermarket because there is still fish, but it's due aquaculture. So that industry called aquaculture basically has been pulled out from nothing in about 20-25 years.
So using beef as an example, can you walk us through the production of beef?
Well, what you need to do, the most, if we think of the environmental impact, first you need to produce quite a lot of feed for the animals. So it's not really natural, organic, few cows here and there walking around in the wild, but it's very intensified. You need to produce a lot of feed for the animals. So that consumes a lot of environmental resources. Then animal is inefficient. So when it eats the feed and basically grows or produces milk, that is inherently quite inefficient. And then do the physics of a cow and basically the birth of a cow, there is a huge methane emission.
So over the past, 10 years or so, the rise in alternative meats like Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and Memphis Meats has been celebrated for sustainability over animal products. Can you share what you're doing at Solar Foods that moves beyond us or beyond plant-based foods?
If you look at the food flow of the food system, basically there are some basic primary outputs from agriculture, different kinds of grains. There's also forage, basically grass and rice, vegetables, fruits. And these are then part of that material primary output do photosynthesis, goes through the concept of animal and turns to meat, fish, and milk, eggs. And part of the material, plant-based material, is consumed as such. These altogether are combined to what we call food. It can be kind of a composite, like sandwich. You might have the cereal part in the bread, a slice of cheese, slice of meat, maybe a slice of tomato. So it's kind of a composite of the primary outputs from agriculture. Now what we see in food tech, ag tech, what is happening is basically as the most of the environmental burden is due to the concept of industrialized animal keeping, we try to process in a simpler or more complex manner plant-based material to resemble animal-based products. So basically, plant-based meat or plant-based dairy are a classical example of that. What we do and how we differ is we produce a kind of new primary ingredient, new wheat that arrives from outside the current food flow and hectares, and it brings up the nutritional value of plant-based materials to correspond that of the animal-based material. And basically, the ingredient what we produce, it vanishes into the products. And the plant-based meat and dairy are one example of very good platforms where our ingredient can be inherently in.
So it sounds like you're creating a whole new category of food.
Yeah, that is correct. The food what we are producing, it's new for the humankind. We haven't had that before. Technology now enables us to grow and harvest it because we are growing single cells. We can understand the concept of wild rabbit, for example. The caveman has, thrown a stone at it because it's big. You can hold it between hands and you can see it, hear it even. But what we are growing, there are 2 micrometers in size. So it's single cells, very small stuff. And historically, we haven't been able to collect and harvest so small species. And it doesn't even end there. If we think of ourselves and other food companies, plant-based materials are a good example that are very much in the rise and basically driving the innovation and market penetration of new foods. But what we are seeing more and more is things like cultured meat. And if we go forward in time to, let's say, 2030, 2050, these technologies actually can build on each other, complement each other. One example is cultured meat. So if we think of world that we don't really grow mammals for meat, but they are completely replaced with cultured meat breweries. In that kind of future, we would not need to produce feed for cows or chicken, but for the cells. So what we are doing, Solar Foods, we're developing a growth media based on our amino acids for the future cultured meat factories. So at the end, we don't expect the consumer to change really their behavior. They can have meat as before, but how that meat was produced and how that meat was fed might have completely changed there behind.
So I want to jump to your core product, which is called Solene. It's a unique single-celled protein created through a fermentation process and developed using a proprietary organism, renewable electricity, water, and air. And if I'm not mistaken, that's it. You've called it food out of thin air. How is that possible? It seems so futuristic.
What we are doing is quite natural. It's very natural food that it might be that it's not very traditional. What we're doing technically is we apply a technology called gas fermentation. So you could compare it to winemaking. In winemaking, you have fermenter, you have an agriculture input, basically the juice from the grapes, sugar's liquid. You add yeast, and this yeast eats sugar for energy and carbon to grow a bit, but also express alcohol to the surrounding liquid. And there you go. What we do is pretty much the same, but in our fermenter, we do have our naturally occurring microbe that we have screened from the nature, completely non-modified. And this microbe does not eat sugar, but it eats hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Hydrogen we make with electricity by splitting water. And CO2 we can capture from the air with a technology called direct air capture. It has also, as for example, solar PV and many of the technologies will be applied today, history in space research. when the cabin air is clean from CO2. So basically, we are combining these technologies together, feed the hydrogen and carbon dioxide in the fermenter, and the organism eats it, and basically creates all the vitamins, all the amino acids, fats, carbs from these constituents. We just grow it. The fermenter liquid grows thicker of the organism. We remove the liquid and dry it, and you end up with a dried single cell powder that happens to be 65% protein.
Talk to me a little bit more about the ability to make this anywhere and at any time.
Actually, we have made a drawing or a map, global map, solarfoods.fi/map. One can go and explore where are the best locations to produce food with our technology. And it is those locations where solar and wind resources, because solar and wind are the cheapest sources of electricity on the planet these days. The best locations to produce food is basically deserts where the solar PV is the cheapest, and in some windy areas on the planet. So basically the current where nothing grows today, it's flipped where those are the best locations. And as we can capture 95% of the ingredients what we need from the air, it's not only carbon dioxide, but also the water what we need, also the nitrogen what we need. You need a bit of inorganic elements in the growth media, in addition to those elements what you capture from the air. But this concept combined with renewable power, you can locate this anywhere on the planet,
or even beyond the planet.
Yeah, that's correct, actually, and that's where the history of the technology is. One could ask that, have you invented this concept? And the answer is not exactly, because these forms of life, what we are using, were identified in connection to the early space research in the 60s.
So continuing on with the concept and the thought around food as a basic necessity, the way we're creating it and also wasting it, right? We're overproducing in many cases and throwing it away. It's destroying our planet. We've clearly hit an inflection point where the way we've producing it just doesn't work anymore. So in what ways can we change the way we produce food at a large scale? And also from an individual perspective, is there anything that we should be doing?
It is the scientist's role and startups' role to provide new technologies and solutions to the individuals so that they are empowered to make good choices. And people can feel that they are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And later on, it's the role of the decision makers to require perhaps some of these technologies by the law. But they can't demand for technologies that don't exist. So it's kind of iterative to offer and demand. And when the consumer is empowered and can make good choices, you have sustainable, non-sustainable choices available, then you can contribute. If we think of what needs to be done in the big picture is unfortunately the concept of industrialized animal keeping has to go. And there are technologies like ourselves where we are producing something naturally curing material. There's also other companies who then producing cultured meat, perhaps using the ingredients what we provide for and the media what we provide for the industry, and also a thing called acellular products. So basically, through modified organisms, you can have those and use those cells as factories to express milk proteins or egg proteins. And there, all these concepts go to the same directions of bypassing the concept of animal. We are also often asked, what about farmers in this kind of future? And in our view, it's obvious that in animal keeping, If you put all the birds on the planet in one pile, 70% of them are chicken. It's really uh, uh, difficult numbers if you start to dive in there. So this animal part might need to go. It can't really scale if we want to stay in the planetary limits. We have exceeded already, but still. But the plant-based part of the equation can remain, and also plant-based materials are interesting platforms for our ingredient. We're just providing. Our role is to provide the animal nutrition part of the story in a more sustainable way.
What is next for Solar Foods? How does this get to market? How does this scale?
As a company, we see our roadmap in 30-month steps. We have the first 30 months behind us, where we rolled out from the lab, from the coffee cup scale, to build what we call a pilot plant. So it's the real continuous production in pilot scale reactors about the size of a man. Next 30 months, we just recently raised our Series A, we're going to build what we call a demo. So it's a real factory, although a bit small. It's kind of a microbrewery. And we go to market with that production. It's not going to be very much, but still we are scaling with in steps. So that is going to happen in about next 30 months, let's say end 22, early 23. And once that demo is working, then we think that's enough of evidence then to go invest into a large scale factory that are about a football pitch in foot, so 70 meters by 100 meters. And with that scale, we are then cost competitive basically against any other protein on the planet.
With the climate crisis accelerating, we had the distinct pleasure of interviewing Christiana Figueres not too long ago, who was responsible for the Paris Climate Agreement. And she basically said that by 2030, we have either made all the right choices in this next decade or we have not. And if we don't, there's no turning back. With that said, what continues to give you hope?
It is in general, technological development, the cycles and the rate at which technologies are developing are just faster. And that gives you hope. We see the world that there are new technologies like personal computing, internet, and good batteries, powerful batteries empower mobile devices that empower apps, that empower social media. And those developments are becoming faster and faster. But we need to be realistic there. We see ourselves not really optimist or pessimist, but rather possibilists. So what happens is that there is a new technology, let's say battery technology or solar foods, protein, or other kinds of things that create to the wall of the future a new window of opportunity. There's something that could not be done before. So it opens a window, and if you look carefully, you can see development happening based and behind that window. Like ourselves, direct air capture of CO2, old space technology, solar PV, which was laughed at as a technology being cost competitive only 5 years ago, was laughed at. Now it's the cheapest source of power on the planet. Hydrogen production, new kinds of proteins, all this development and narrative and people being aware or even acknowledging that food might be a problem. It was a completely different world only 5 years ago. So what happens in the next 5 years or in a decade? A lot can happen due to the faster and faster technological development.
Well, what you're doing gives me hope. And, I just had a daughter who's turning 2 months this week. And knowing that there are people like you doing such incredible work in the world to guarantee a future for her is incredibly meaningful. So thank you so much for your time.